In Lin-Manuel Miranda's now utterly iconic musical Hamilton, there are many extraordinary moments. It would be difficult to pick one that stands out above the others. But for me, there is a moment in it that is unlike any other. It is toward the end of the show, where fortune and Alexander Hamilton's tragic choices have brought calamitous consequences to his family, to himself and his career, and he begs his wife, Eliza, for forgiveness. It's a magnificent song, choreographed beautifully, and the cast sings about this task that he has. He is trying to do the unimaginable, because it is unimaginable what Alexander is asking Eliza for forgiveness for. He had sanctioned a duel for his son, and his son is murdered at the end of the duel. And in the larger picture for their family, insofar as how they are portrayed to the world, Alexander had committed adultery and wrote about it publicly, exposing Eliza to unimaginable shame and humiliation. The unimaginable indeed. But when Eliza takes Alexander's hand in a breathtakingly tender gesture, the actress that is portraying Eliza's sister, Angelica, defines the pardon that Eliza grants at that moment and the love she can still find, because she never lost it, for Alexander. Angelica sings about that act of forgiveness as a grace too powerful to name. Lin-Manuel Miranda's lyrics are breathtaking. Forgiveness as a grace too powerful to name. And not everyone associates the idea of grace with Judaism, but in fact, it is the word chen, or anyone you know named Hannah. Her name is essentially grace. It's one of my favorite names, actually. So grace, or the notion of forgiveness or finding favor, over and over again, Moses particularly asks God things like, if I have found favor in your eyes. That's usually how it's translated, but I would translate it as, if I have found grace. That notion of graciousness, of givingness, and in this context, forgiveness. Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory describes moments that changed the world. 1439, when Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, though he reminds us the Chinese had developed it 4 centuries before. In 1821, when Faraday invented the electric motor. In 1990, when Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web. But in this week's Parsha, there is an additional moment that changes the world. And that is the first recorded act of forgiveness. Certainly the first recorded act of forgiveness in biblical history, and as far as we know, the first recorded act of forgiveness in human history, appears in this week's Parsha. Joseph's brothers stand before him, oblivious to the identity of the Egyptian viceroy who will determine their fate. It has been a long slog. Joseph has tested them in an elaborately choreographed scheme to determine whether they have truly changed since that fateful day that they almost murdered their dreamer brother. With Judah's impassioned plea and excruciating description of their father Jacob's torment since Joseph's disappearance, Joseph can finally bear it no longer. He weeps loudly in an anteroom and then composes himself. he can then reveal himself to his speechless brothers and offer bountiful absolution that could also aptly be described as a grace too powerful to name. When they approached, Joseph said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into slavery. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourself because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance." That was earlier in our parsha today, Genesis 45, verses 4, 5, and 7. Now you'll notice that Joseph doesn't explicitly say, "I forgive you." That word actually doesn't show up until chapter 50 in a rather fascinating white lie that the brothers come up with, where they tell Joseph that Papa Jacob said, "You should forgive us." So they are still negotiating this as the chapters go. But at this point, this act of grace is stunning every time. Joseph's exoneration of his brothers is an entirely new display of magnanimity and maturity in this Torah, isn't it? He doesn't let them forget their transgression. He reminds them of it straight away. But he also doesn't play the victim. He knows his place high atop the Egyptian hierarchy, and he wears his responsibilities well and fully. He does not shrink in front of them. He does not revert to an earlier position of him being down in the pit and them looking down at him, scoffing. He has chosen the path of compassion and mercy, and he sees a grand design in the unfolding of his life story, despite or maybe because of the terrible wrongs done to him so many years before. Friends, have you ever granted or been granted that kind of forgiveness? Do you sit here today yearning for it, for someone you have wronged? Can you imagine asking for such a pardon? Notice the brothers have yet to do so. Joseph gives it before they've said a word about it. But could you imagine asking someone for such a pardon? Maybe you ache from a wrong that was done to you and for which forgiveness has never been asked. What would you do if you received a sincere plea for forgiveness from someone else? Could you let go of the hurt? Forgiveness is absolutely essential for an evolving society, but is it painfully elusive. People often nurture grudges and resentments for years or even lifetimes, often taking those grudges with them to the grave and beyond. Why? Because they often believe that to forgive would be somehow to condone the injustice and evil that was done to them. And pride and shame inhibit too many who need desperately to seek pardon, and not just to seek pardon, but to do the painful work of repair. And when neither of those things happen, stalemate or worse sets in. Abraham Thomas is an engineer who studies the workings of the human brain, bless him, and he writes wisely about the pathways to forgiveness. This is what he says: "Forgiveness stills resentment and guilt and places common sense in control. Forgiveness towards others discards petty resentment and enables fair judgment. Forgiveness towards oneself, because often we are the last to forgive ourselves, forgiveness towards oneself frees the mind from the debilitating pain of guilt. Resentment and guilt resemble the futile actions of a bird flailing against a cage, unhealthy yelps and squeals of the primitive regions of the brain against unacceptable situations. Forgiveness quiets those regions. It is a process which accepts the offensive situation, making way for the calm responses of wiser regions of the brain. While it does not imply acceptance of evil, forgiveness accepts reality and strengthens the mind to be able to begin to move forward. Abraham Thomas mentions something called the Worthington Program. Another social scientist, Everett L. Worthington, who recommends decisional and emotional forgiveness. A decision not to seek revenge or to avoid the person reduces the stress. But the objective should be to replace resentment, bitterness, hostility, hatred, anger, and fear with love, compassion, sympathy, and empathy. This prevents subconscious obsessions about the wrongs done to us, which we all know so well, lead to anxiety, depression, and worse. Everett Worthington devised a 5-step program called REACH, R-E-A-C-H. I don't do a lot of acronyms, but I liked this one. It's called REACH, and the goal is to achieve emotional forgiveness. First, R, recall the hurt objectively without blame and self-victimization. Then E, empathize by trying, and I know it's hard, friends, to imagine the viewpoint of the person who committed the wrong. After that, A, altruism. Try to experience the feeling yourself of being forgiven by someone else and how good and gracious and liberating that can feel or has felt. This is followed by C, a commitment to actually forgiving a person. And H, the hardest of all, holding on to it once you've done it. To recall, to empathize, to have altruism, to commit, and to hold. Reach. Now I love that because the word vayigash means and he approached. So it doesn't exactly mean reached, but it certainly suggests a kind of coming near, doesn't it? And actually 3 times at the beginning of this parsha we hear, and he approached. Judah approaches Joseph. Joseph says, approach, my brothers. And they approached. It's almost as if the Torah is not being very subtle in suggesting that this kind of work, this kind of reaching takes work. It doesn't happen the first time. Not for nothing do we say in traditional Judaism that you have to approach somebody 3 times to ask forgiveness. If it's not granted after 3 times, well, the fault transfers. You're forgiven in the divine scheme, because it's hard to ask for forgiveness even once, let alone 3 times. You have to reach for it. But Joseph's exoneration of his brothers was exactly that, wasn't it? Go back and comb through it. It's wonderfully written. He quiets the clamor for vengeance a couple of times. He demonstrates compassionate empathy to his brothers, but he doesn't sanction their evil. And he embraces the healing potential of forgiveness. He is calm after his emotional storm. He speaks firmly but with benevolence. He finds meaning and larger, capital T, truths in tragedy, and quite literally, rises above it all. Rabbi Asher Lopatin gives voice to one of my most fervent prayers. I say it every day, that Jews might yet find a way to live by the values of Vayigash. He writes, when Jews criticize Jews of other denominations or debate politics, Israel, theological or even ethical issues, we need to do it in a way that reflects respect and love and graciousness toward one another. We have to find ways of eating in each other's homes, of praying in each other's synagogues, and attending each other's diverse, joyous moments and sad moments. We have to maintain our own integrity as Judah's and Joseph's, but we have to approach. Vayigash. We have to reach out for unity and partnership. In that gorgeous Haftarah, the prophet Ezekiel envisions the staffs of Judah and the staff of Joseph entwining to symbolize one multifaceted people, reconciled with each other and their creator in a brit shalom. A covenant of friendship is how it's often translated. We would probably just translate it as a covenant of peace. But a covenant of friendship is how the Etz Chaim translates. Only when we have peace and friendship within ourselves can we have peace and friendship with each other. Only when we have peace and friendship with each other can we have peace and friendship with our neighbors in the world. And only when forgiveness, that grace too powerful to name, only when forgiveness is given a chance will the light of a new era dawn. May it be so in our time. Shabbat Shalom.